Hello and welcome to Intro to Design video 5. In this video we're going to talk about slicers and how to change print time for the same part by changing features in your slicer. So to start off with, we're going to look at this piece. It's going to be 0.2 millimeter as our datum point. This is generic ABS, as this is actually a cup holder insert for a car, and I would recommend using ABS for that, as a PLA might actually distort or even melt if it gets into a hot enough car. And 15% infill. So let's slice this and see what it does. First thing we can see is that it has 555 layers that it'll take to print this item. It'll take 26 meters of filament to print it and 8.5 hours to print the whole item. So if we actually take a quick close look at what this will look like, you can see that it has an infill, is the red portion there, and it's just going to build it up and up and up until it's done. But if you're looking closely, you can see it has the lines for each layer when it prints. So these are some things to just look at when you're slicing a part. One way to reduce print time is to change your infill percentage, especially for bigger parts like this. So we're going to change it from 15 to 10%, and let's see what that does. As you can see, it does not change the number of layers that it does, but it does change the amount of filament used to 25.39, and it has reduced it to 7 hours and 45 minutes. So 45 minutes has been taken away just by doing that. And the reason for that is if we actually slice down to a portion here, the infill is actually more spaced out. So it's using less filament for each layer to do the infill. Another way of changing print time when it comes to infill, if you go to your printer settings and go to infill, you can actually change the different patterns, and you'll just have to play with it on your slicer. I typically use 3D infills for stuff that sees forces from multiple directions, as opposed to, let's say, a rectilinear, which is more of like a box infill. I would use that more for something that might see one or two directions of force. So you'll have to really think about what is going to apply onto your piece, but that also depends on if that matters or not. For me, I'm thinking more of a design standpoint. If it's a little minifigure, it doesn't really matter. So the next thing we're going to look at is changing the layer height and seeing what that does for impact. So we're going to change it to 0.3 millimeters layer height, and then keep it at a 15% infill to compare to the 0.2 at 15, and let's see what that does. One thing you'll notice right away is we now have 370 layers as opposed to the 555. You'll see that it's a lot rougher. That's because you're going to have higher gaps between each layer. And we're using more material because it has to push out more material to make up for those gap heights. But the biggest thing that you're going to see is now we're at 4 hours and 47 minutes of print time. So we've reduced it by almost 4 hours compared to the original 0.2 at 15%. So those are some things to consider when it comes to print time for layer height and infill. Other things that you can play with, if you go back to your printer settings and go to layers, you can change the perimeters, which is the number of rings that it'll do around the part, or the shells, which is the top and bottom layers. That won't impact it too much, but the perimeters will. So the perimeters are actually these lines right here. So this orange and yellow line, one's the outside, one's the inside. So if we had more perimeters, it would do more around, and that would actually increase it, but it gives it more strength. If we do less, it'll decrease the time, but it'll decrease the strength. So things to think about when you're printing with those portions as well. Another thing we'd have to consider is the support for this overhang. I actually printed it with these settings, and I only had to take off one ring of filament right around here. It wasn't a big deal, but let's say it was more critical to have that. Let's see what happens when we choose support on build plate. So with this green area here is our support to help so that this won't fall apart when it's printing. You can see it's very dense, but this is going to allow it to have an area for the overhang to print onto. So for this part, you may not have to worry about it, but let's say you had something that's hanging in space, you might need to have a support for that before it connects to the rest of the model. And as you can see, it's going to use a lot of filament, 47 meters, and it's increased it back up to almost 8 hours print time. So one way to reduce that print time, again, depending on the size of the print, a minifigure, I would keep these default settings because they're so small. But let's say for this part here, we can go to printing settings, support material, and change the pattern spacing to 8. And once we slice this, you'll see a difference. As you can see, there's a big difference between the portions that are supports. It's decreased it to now just under 7 hours, and we're using less filament with only 43 meters used compared to before. So these are just a couple things to consider to change print times for your model when you're printing them. Definitely try to play with them in your own slicer and learn what you have at your fingertips. And if you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments. Otherwise, this is Tyler with 3D Printer Store, and I hope you have a great day.